Hello, and welcome to the Great Plague. As you can see, it's dark and stormy here, but that's alright, because we're about to be some riders on the storm. Allow me to read to you an excerpt. Let's suppose, hypothetically speaking, that you happen to be Jim Morrison and have recently arrived in Laurel Canyon and now find yourself fronting a band that is on the verge of taking the country by storm. Just a mile or so down the boulevard from you lives another guy who also recently arrived in Laurel Canyon and who also happens to front a band on the verge of stardom. He happens to be married to a girl that you attended kindergarten with, and her dad, like yours, was involved in atomic weapons research and testing. Her husband's dad, meanwhile, is involved in another type of WMD research, chemical warfare. This other guy's business partner slash manager is a spooky ex-Marine who just happens to have a cousin who also fronts a rock band on the verge of superstardom. And this third rock star on the rise also happens to live in Laurel Canyon, just a mile or two from your house. Just a couple other streets over, within walking distance of your home, are two other kids who also happen to front a new rock and roll band. These two kids happen to attend the same Alexandria, Virginia high school that you attended, and one of them attended Annapolis just like your dad did, and just like your kindergarten friend's dad did. Though almost all of you hail from Washington, D.C. area, you now find yourself on the opposite side of the country in an isolated canyon high above the city of Los Angeles, where you are all clustered around a secret military installation. Given his background in research on atomic weapons, your father is probably familiar to some extent with the existence and operations of Lookout Mountain Laboratory, as is the father of your kindergarten friend. Now the writer, as you can see, he has kind of a little bit of an extra writing style, a little bit florid. But let me summarize what he's saying here. A whole bunch of people who knew each other, all their parents were in the military, back on the East Coast in Virginia, around Washington, D.C. area. All these people went to kindergarten together. And now all of a sudden they find themselves on the West Coast fronting these famous rock bands, and they're all living in the same town with a bunch of other people whose parents are all high-level military intelligence type people. And the whole thing is situated right by a big military base who specialize in psychological warfare. So let's look a little bit more. Get me a lead singer. He's got sort of an androgynous blonde hair, very pretty. Get me a pound of bass player, a pound of drummer. They hire a producer, they hire writers, and in the current stuff, they don't even bother getting people to play. Don't bother with that guitar player nonsense. The people in those bands can't write, play, or sing. David Crosby describing the synthetic manufactured nature of today's rock bands. And so you might be thinking, why on earth would you get a bunch of rock stars who can't play their instruments? That question is answered in this book, but we're going to talk about that later. We're going to read a little bit more about Jim Morrison. Morrison essentially arrived on the scene as a fully developed rock star, a stage persona, an impressive collection of songs, enough in fact to fill the Doors' first few albums. How he reinvented himself in such a radical manner remains something of a mystery, since before his sudden incarnation as a singer-songwriter, James Douglas Morrison had never shown the slightest interest in music. none whatsoever. He never studied music and could neither read nor write it. By his own account, he never had much of an interest in listening to music. He told one interviewer that he never went to concerts. Before joining the Doors, he never did any singing. I never even conceived of it. And yet somehow, he showed up with all those hit songs that you know from the Doors already written. A guy who didn't play music, never did any singing, never conceived of it in his own words, and yet he sat down and wrote the hit songs for 3 or 4 or 5 different Doors albums before he ever met his other band members. So here we had a guy who never sang, never even conceived of the notion that he could open his mouth and make sounds come out, could not play an instrument, had no interest in learning to, and who had never much listened to music or been anywhere near a band. And yet he somehow emerged, virtually overnight, as a fully formed rock star who would quickly become an icon of his generation. Even more bizarrely, legend holds that he brought with him enough original songs to fill the first few Doors albums. Morrison did not, you see, do as other singers-songwriters do and pen the songs over the course of the band's career. Instead, he wrote them all at once, allegedly, before the band was even formed. As Jim once acknowledged, he was not a very prolific songwriter. Most of the songs I've written, I wrote in the very beginning, about 3 years ago. I just had a period when I wrote a lot of songs. So a guy with no interest in music, can't write music, can't play an instrument, can't sing, writes all these hit songs. What possessed him to write these songs? Well, we're going to find out right now. In fact, all the good songs that Morrison is credited with writing were written during that period. The period during which, according to rock legend, here it is, Jim spent most of his time hanging out on the rooftop of a Venice apartment building consuming copious amounts of LSD. So the legend is, a man with no musical training, cannot play an instrument, cannot write nor read music, never thought about singing, just suddenly developed the ability to write hit songs because he took LSD. Now you may be thinking that sounds ridiculous, but think about what is being said here. Think about the message, the doors of perception, right? They want the kids who they influence through this music to do drugs, to do LSD, to think that LSD will somehow bestow upon you these incredible creative powers where you can just suddenly learn how to, without knowing how to write music, just hum it in your head, all these hit songs, wrote them all down somehow, had it all written down, and then you suddenly just get the notion to form one of the biggest rock groups ever. In any event, the question that naturally rises is, how did Jim, the Lizard King, write that impressive batch of songs? I'm no musician myself, but it is my understanding that just about every singer-songwriter composes his or her songs in essentially the same manner, on an instrument, usually either a piano or guitar. Some writers can compose on paper, but that requires a skill set that Jim did not possess. He would have to have composed them, I'm guessing, in his head. So we are to believe that a few dozen complete songs never heard by anyone and never played by any musician existed only in Jim Morrison's acid-addled brain. But even if we accept that premise, we are still left with some nagging questions, including the question of how those songs got out of Jim Morrison's head and onto a sheet of music. It should be clarified that these are songs we are talking about as opposed to just lyrics. Because people are going to say, no, he just wrote poems. He had all these poems. No, he had the songs. All the songs were written by Jim Morrison. Anyway, the point is that none of the four members of the Doors had any real band credentials. Even a band as contrived as the Byrds had members with band credentials. So too did Buffalo Springfield. The Mamas and the Papas were put together from elements of the Journeymen, etc., and so goes with the rest of the Laurel Canyon bands. The Doors could cite no such lineage. They were just four guys who happened to come together to play the songs written by the singer who had never sung but who had a sudden calling and magical gift for songwriting. And who were all sons and daughters of the military-industrial complex. And they are putting out music that pretended to be about peace and love, but it really wasn't. It was about doing drugs, and it was about introspection, and it was about self-destruction. Because isn't that what Jim Morrison's career arc, his character arc was about? Self-destruction. Live fast, die young. So, Jim Morrison was a fake. Now, you may not believe that based on what I've said here, but I guarantee if you read this book, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, you will understand. There's something else I want to show you here too. This is also about Jim Morrison. This is a photo. That's Jim Morrison right there. And that's his father, a mass murderer who staged an attack in order to justify an illegal war to murder millions and millions of people. And there he is on the deck of his Navy boat. Jim Morrison never once ever wrote an anti-war song. Think about it. He wrote a song about serial killers, riders on the storm. What anti-war song did Jim Morrison ever write? Just because he was part of the establishment. You see in this quote from the man himself? I think these days, especially in the States, right, he's talking about himself. You have to be a politician or an assassin or something to really be a superstar. If you want to stage a band, why not just get people who can really play? You could still find people who are down with the program who could play their instruments. Why did it have to be these people who were superstars? Because they had a star quality that had nothing to do with musicianship. And that star quality related to their family relations and their relation to the death cult and their ability to spread out negative messages to influence us all. So in closing, Jim Morrison, one of the biggest superstars in American history, was a fake, a fraud. He had a bunch of songs and poems written by occult priests. And he was chosen to play a role, a character, to lead people astray, and to lead them into self-destruction. But make no mistake, Jim Morrison is probably still alive.